Welcome back, DPR Review TV viewers. It is Chris Nichols here, and today we are playing with a brand new Fujifilm 33mm 1.4 WR, and I'm okay with this video today because it's not a 35, it's a 33. Very important distinction, and of course gives us a 50mm on full frame field of view. Now I also want to mention that I had an opportunity to take this camera to the East Coast, so you get a bit of a different sample gallery, but of course Jordan and I are here together again in Calgary, so we're going to do our review. Now there's definitely a question that comes up. This lens is only 2mm different than the older 35mm 1.4 lens. And you think, okay, well Chris, that lens is almost a decade old. That means Fujifilm is going to replace it with this lens. But interestingly enough, that's not the case. Fujifilm has told us they're keeping both lenses. So that's kind of strange. I mean, the older 35mm 1.4, we've played with and compared it to other lenses like the F2 versions. I mean, it is an interesting lens. It's got character. It has beautiful bokeh, but it had softness in the corners. There's other issues too. So really what I want to see here today is, does this new 33mm focus faster? Does it have better optical performance? Does it have nice bokeh? And will it have enough character to appease the people who are really concerned with that kind of stuff in their photos? And if so, then hopefully answer the question, does the older 35mm still have to be around? So the older 35mm lens was always light and easy to carry around, and the new 33mm is heavier and larger. So first off, the filter diameter steps up from 52mm to 58mm. As well, the weight, the 33mm is 360 grams. Now that's still not heavy. I mean, that is the weight of 360 thumbtacks, but in the grand scheme of things, that's still very easy to carry around, if not somewhat dangerous. But really the big change is that you have weather resistance now, and so I'm perfectly fine with getting that, even if the lens is slightly larger and heavier. Today is supposed to be overcast and a thunderstorm at 4 o'clock, so we're kind of under the wire, but the sun broke out for a brief moment, so of course I slapped both lenses on, start doing some tests for flare. I didn't think I was going to be able to do that today. And here's what we're kind of seeing. First off, I would say both lenses are pretty similar as far as when you've got a bright light source in the frame, how much loss of contrast do you get? In fact, I would say the older lens is maybe just a little bit lower in contrast, washing out a little bit, whereas the newer 33 seem to handle that better. Now the 33mm lens does seem to have more reflections. You can see some ghosting here, some interesting rainbow patterns, and the 35mm lens seems to control that better. But I also feel that the 33mm lens gives us nicer sunstars. In fact, you can see it's quite dramatic, and it's hard to actually get nice sunstars in the older 35mm. So although the 35mm and the 33 have very similar results when shooting towards the sun, I'd say that the 33, the newer lens, is a little bit more interesting. All right, so we did our autofocus performance test between the two lenses. And first off, the older lens, let's talk about that. Now, users have often reported that it's got sluggish autofocus performance. I mean, you can hear the motor going with the autofocus, and when you see the focus acquire its lock, it does jitter a little bit. Absolutely, it's not as smooth. The newer 33mm, the autofocus is silent, and there's none of that jitter. But looking at our two tests here, they both seem to get to the same point at the same time. So I wouldn't say that the new 33mm is any faster, it's just smoother.
Jordan here to talk about using the 33mm F1.4 for video work, and Chris is actually filming me on it right now, wide open, so you can see it's lovely when you're doing that. Now, another thing that's quite lovely is when you're pulling focus, there's very little focus breathing in this lens, so you're not going to notice when you're going from foreground to background, the frame kind of zooming a little bit, which can be quite distracting. This controls that very well. One other thing that was kind of a drawback, though, is something that we saw on the 18mm F1.4 as well, and that's that if you're manually focusing and set the camera to linear response, which you generally want to do for focus pulls, it is extremely sensitive, so much so that I found it quite difficult to get it right on my subject. Switch it back to nonlinear focus, that's not a problem, but then you can't do repeatable focus pulls. It is something they could fix in firmware, and I'd love to see them do that. But otherwise, this is a great little video lens.
So it looks like that sun never really came out again. So as usual, we're gonna have to do some more sample photos, get some more testing done, check everything on the computer, and when we come back, we'll have our final conclusions. Okay, so we've had a chance to look at the files here. Let's talk about bokeh first. And I was really interested to see this because the 35mm 1.4 is famous for having beautiful rendering of out of focus areas and bokeh. So Let's first take a look at our autofocus specular highlights at 1.4. Now you can see here both quite similar, both quite clean. However, the new 33 has less cat's eye than the older 35. Now when we stop things down to 2.8, you can see another thing here. The old lens has a 7-bladed iris, this has a 9-bladed iris, and you can see how the bokeh balls in the background on the 33mm are actually more round. And so that's another positive, I think. It's a slight difference, but it's there. But the next we want to look at is just how the bokeh transitions from in focus to out of focus, because that's something that the old 35mm did very nicely. And actually in these samples, you can see here, actually the transition from in of focus to out of focus is very similar between the two lenses. I have a really hard time really seeing any sort of difference. So although the bokeh balls are better on the newer 33, it still maintains that same classic character of the 35 as far as bokeh in focus to out of focus. Now let's talk about sharpness. And I was curious about this because the old 35mm classically was a very sharp lens in the center, even wide open, but the corners had some trouble until you stop down the aperture. And we can see that here. So looking at the samples, the old 35mm 1.4 is actually, I would even say, ever so slightly sharper than the 33, and the center is wide open. Not enough to make a big difference, but it's there. But when you look at the corners of both lenses wide open, you can see how the older 35 kind of gets that blurry smudging effect in the corners. The 33 is still soft in the corners, but it does avoid that blurry, smudgy kind of look. Now, once you stop both lenses down a little bit, then they both become excellent right across the field, and I really couldn't tell any difference between the two samples. So I would say we've got a slight improvement here in the corners overall, but again, both lenses are very similar in the way they render sharpness. So this was an interesting test for me because it's rare that a company will keep both an older lens and a very similar newer lens on the market and say that they're both still being sold, which means that you, the buyer, have to pick between the two. And yet when looking at these two lenses, overall, I feel that the new 33mm basically improves in pretty much every way, shape, and form over the older lens. I mean, it's slightly bigger and heavier, but not in an unmanageable way. But you get the weather sealing, you get things like slightly nicer bokeh, same kind of character otherwise the bokeh. And so although both lenses are very similar, I have a hard time seeing why I would go with the older lens over the newer lens. I don't feel like I'm compromising anything with the newer lens. Okay, but what about the cost of the two lenses? Maybe that will justify the difference. As you can see, it's not really that big a difference. And I really think that the extra money, it's worth spending to get all the benefits of the new 33mm lens. So hopefully Fujifilm will drop the price on the 35mm. That might make it more appealing. And I think on the used market, you might find it also drop in price. You can get some really good deals because it is otherwise still a classic and beautiful lens to use. But I know that I would probably go with the new 33mm. And as you've probably seen, there's also a whole bunch of Fujifilm announcements that have just been released. So go to deepreview.com. You can see all those on the front page, and that'll keep you up to date. As well, do check out the link in the description below. The sample gallery for this brand new 33mm lens is there waiting for you to check it out. But otherwise, as always, really appreciate you guys joining us, and we shall see you all soon.